Greetings once again. Couple days off. A bit of a rough couple days. Brain wasn't working well enough to read or art stuff productively. There really isn't much point in trying to do stuff for an audience if you're not going to do it at a high level. So instead, I can understand the finicky, fragile nature of professional actors a little bit more, like in movies. Hiding in their trailer or whatever, coddling themselves until it's time for their scenes. It's not like being just a regular worker on the set, a grip or something. Anyway, here we go with chapter 15, Stone Men and Dead Men. The end of June in 1948 saw the last stragglers of the spring deer migration passing out of the Windy River country, thereby bringing Andy's caribou studies to a temporary halt. We decided to follow the deer into the northern barrens, and our choice of a destination was Ankuni Lake. Ankuni, the Great Lake, lies halfway down the River of Men, and we chose it for two reasons. In the first place, it was once the scene of the greatest deer concentrations known to the hamlet, which would make it rewarding for Andy. And in the second place, it lies in the very heart of the interior plains, and thus it offered us an excellent base from which I could continue my investigations into the history of the inland people. Tyrrell was the first white man to reach Ankuni, and since his visit in 1894, it has been seen by only 2 or 3 other white men. Very little of its contorted shoreline has been mapped, and no one knows the lake's true extent, though I should think it must be at least 40 miles in length. When Tyrrell passed across the lake, he saw, but did not visit, one camp which may have held 200 Eskimos, and this was only one of many camps along the bays and inlets. From stories told to me by Hikwa and Ohoto, I knew that somewhere near the turn of the century, Ankuni had probably been the site of the largest Eskimo encampments ever known throughout the Arctic region. Those camps are all empty now, and no man lives beside Ankuni's shores, but I hope a visit to the lake might still reveal the answers to many unsolved riddles about the old days of the people. With much hesitation, Ohoto had agreed to accompany us as a guide, but his emotions as he contemplated the trip were mixed. In more than 30 years, no Ahelmeo had visited the Great Lake, nor had anyone dared travel down the river, for these waters no longer knew the tents of living people. Only shallow graves and restless spirits remained along their shores. Ohoto and his dead father, Eliatutna, had been born in one of the largest camps of the Ankuni group, and so the land was dear to Ohoto's youth, and he felt drawn to it, though at the same time he was repelled by his fears of a dead land and its unseen inhabitants. It would be tedious to write at length about the river above the Great Lake, for graves, rapids, and falls are all of a kind, even when they stretch for 200 miles. I shall begin the story of our visit to Ankuni on the day when our canoe came in sight of the famous hill called Kinatua, which guards the western entry to the lake. Ohoto was in the bow that day, and when he identified the looming majesty of the great hill, we knew we had achieved our goal, in space at least. We bore down on Kinatua, and the river flung us angrily from side to side in a rocky gorge before it gave us up to the war it had waged against us, and the mutter of its tormented waters ceased. The current sank away and dissipated its strength in the still waters of Kinatua Bay. Kinatua itself hung over us and cut off the sinking sun so that we moved in shadow. Although on the distant north shore, the sun still flung a clear yellow light over the old encampments of the Kinetu Kinetuamuit, Kinetuamiut, as the Ankuni group of the Hamlet had been called. The long hills rolled up green from Ankuni Lake, which stretched to the horizon ahead of us. The canoe drifted idly on still waters, and nothing in all that vast world moved or lived save we three intruders and a white-winged gull. The Kinnitua mute were gone, the living men were gone, and yet the land was not quite so deserted as it seemed. We landed at the foot of Kinnitua and climbed its receding slopes until we stood on the back of the mounded giant. From the crest, we looked far out over the sodden muskegs, past ridges, eskers, and little lakelets, and as far as the most distant glitter of the Great Lake's southern bays. We looked out over a dead land, but not a deserted one, for our eyes quickly discovered the shapes of men standing in monumental immobility on every side of us. They were men, but men of stone. Insensate little pillars of flat rocks piled precariously atop each other, they stood on every hill, by every lake and river, as they have stood throughout the long ages of people who created them and called them Inukok, semblances of men. They are such puny monuments, these lone inhabitants of emptiness, it seems inevitable that they must topple into anonymity of the rocky slopes from which they sprang. And yet they did not fall. They stand immutable, contemptuous of the winter gales and of the passing years, imbued with an essential quality that belies their faceless forms and gives to them more than a semblance of reality as men. More real, more vital are these shapeless things than the cold-eyed statues of our great museums. This is because they were not built to keep some memory green, nor to express the hidden passions of a sculptor's hands. The Inukok have being, because they were created as the guardians of living men against a loneliness which is immeasurable. When the first men came this way, restlessly probing into unknown lands, he paused upon some hill before he ventured further into the obscurity ahead, and here he raised the figure of an Inukok. Then, as he went forward into the boundless distances, he retained a fragile link with his familiar world as long as he could still discern the dwindling figure of the man of stone. Before it disappeared behind him, the traveler paused to build another Inukok, and so another, until his journey ended and he turned back, or until he no longer needed the stone men to bind him to reality and life. The Inukok are not signposts, just simple landmarks, as most white men have thought. They are, or were, the guardians who stolidly resisted the implacable menace of space uncircumscribed, which can unhinge the finite minds of men. From the crest of Kinnitua, we looked out and saw these lifeless beings and were confronted, comforted, to see them standing there. For a long time we three were silent as we gazed out over the Ankuni hills, studded with their motionless sentinels. The light was going, and the bay lay motionless before us, when at last Ohoto broke into our thoughts. "This is the place," he said. "Here stood my father's camp, and it will not be strange if he should come to me, and if I again hear his voice that has been silent for winters past." It was a true prophecy he made, but on that evening Andy and I paid it little heed. Descending the hill then, we paddled across the bay of Kinnitua and pitched our tents on a sloping shelf along the northern shore. Andy and I were very tired, but there was little rest for us that night. We lay sleepless for hours, listening to the voice of Ohoto as he sat in the darkness outside and chanted the thin, lugubrious songs which are sung only for dead ears. In the morning, Our little travel tents were filled with a fresh and boisterous breeze. The mood of the previous night had vanished. I stood outside the tent and looked at the spacious and aloof beauty of the country as it lay revealed under a brilliant sun. Northward, the great bare hills rolled into a white sky only faintly touched with an ephemeral blue. The soft and flowing colors of the lichens and the grassy swales seemed to assume the properties of motion, as the wind hurled itself up the valleys and over the far crests. The wind brought a measure of life to a lifeless land, and while the wind blew, the loneliness was held at bay. Below our camp, the clear waters of Ancuni flickered under the wind's touch as the seas built up and drove toward a dim line of ridges on the southern shore. At our feet was the broad, low path of a huge isthmus cutting across the lake to lose itself in the bright distance. There were no trees nor other ragged upward shapes to break the smooth contours of the land, the swollen continuity of curving space. But hidden in some favored valleys were a few tiny forests, each consisting of a dozen or so scrawny spruces, none of which stood more than a yard high. Poor, ugly little things, they thrust their heads upward until they were on a level with the shoulders of the shallow valleys. Then they were caught and cut down by the scythe of the winds. Held down by that invisible barrier of air, they spread outward, growing like plants beneath a pane of glass. The wind is master in that land, but we blessed it for its simple presence, since while it blew, the haze of flies was held impotent in the shelter of the lichens. Breakfast was mercifully free of flies on our first day at Ancuni, and afterwards we took advantage of the wind's kindness and went exploring. Ohoto was the first to leave the camp, and he went inland, ostensibly to scan the wastes for signs of deer. I watched him idly as he grew smaller in the distance, and then I saw him pause. Lifting my binoculars, I watched while he heaped up a little pile of rocks upon a ridge. In a few moments it was done, and Ohoto passed out of sight over the rise, leaving yet another Inukhak to stand against the barren sky. That's barren's capital B, possessive, not barren sky, lowercase b. We have brought with us a copy of Tyrrell's sketch map, the only existing map of Ancuni, and while Andy went to examine the measure the antlers of some long dead deer, I set off along the shore of Kinatua Bay to try to find the Eskimo campsite Tyrrell had seen and recorded 50 years before. Half a mile away, I came to a rocky point which was labeled Anita's Camp on Tyrrell's map. Little triangles printed on the sheet indicated that 3 tents had stood here in Tyrrell's time. I cast about and at last came upon 3 circles of boulders, half hidden in the moss and lichens. I walked into the center of one of these tent rings, for such they were, and found the hearth, and in it the blackened embers of a fire which looked to be so recent it startled me. For a brief moment I almost believed this camp had been deserted only yesterday, and that its owners might return at any moment. I raised my eyes and searched the glittering surface of the water, but nothing moved, and the illusion passed. Only then did I remember that decay and rot are almost strangers to the barren lands. In this world of clean sun and wind, both wood and things of bone seem to possess a strange immortality, so that after centuries they still retain the form they had when they first brought the rest to rest amongst the boulder heaps. I particularly remembered finding a roll of birch bark, some 300 miles north of the forests, where the last birch trees grow. That bark, intended for the repair of some Indian canoe, had faced the hunger of years for at least 3 generations, and when I found it, it was still sound and untouched by rot. This relative absence of decay is an important thing to men who are driven to pry into times long past. The tent and igloo dwellings, Baron's people, left little enough to mark their passing, but because of this victory of matter over dissolution, what little did remain has been miraculously preserved to tell its tale of a clear tongue, with a clear tongue. Examining Anita's camp more closely, I came upon part of a human skull lying in a little bed of dark, coarse hair which had once cushioned the skull from snow and sun, and which now cushioned it against the weight of years. There was no grave nearby, and so the skull suggested that when death came to this camp, he took all men, leaving none to obey the law, which says men must have sufficient burial. There was further evidence of sudden tragedy, for near at hand were the precious poles which had once held up the tents. The tents themselves had long since vanished into the bellies of mice and wolverines, but the poles remained, and tent poles in that land of little sticks are not abandoned unless no man still lives to use them any longer. The thick moss within the boulder rings veiled other things as well: a copper fishhook, a ladle of muskox horn, and a little wooden spool which had once held white man's thread. The spool alone was of our time, and many have been one of the gifts Tyrrell left with the people whose fleets of kayaks welcomed him under Kinatua. All of these things that I have found, mute in themselves, created voices in my mind. They told me that death had struck Anita's camp after his first visit by a white man, but before the goods of the traders became common in the land. The sun-whitened cylinder of wood and the fragments of tools told me who Anita's killer was, for I knew that the great pain of Kakumi's bringing had come into the land less than 2 decades after Tyrrell, and before the Inuit met the traders on the borders of the Barrens. I left Anita's camp and walked westward along the shore, passing rows of miniature inukoks set up by children at their play, the pathetic little products of dead hands. After a time, I came to a shallow inlet backed by a massive cliff, and in this sheltered place I found a soft green swale running down to the only sand beach I saw on Great Lake. The Great Lake. It was an oasis, a warm and gentle place, and on that grassy meadow I found the tent rings of a mighty camp. There were perhaps 30 rings scattered here and there, and at least 18 of these had been in use when last the site was occupied by man. But like Anita's place, this site had also been deserted suddenly. In and around the rings, I found the tools of Ohoto's people. Here was a wooden tugli from a woman's hair. I think the last time that word tugli was used, it was the wife of the young man who went to confront Kakumi and get his gun back. She took it off because she expected him to die, and it was preemptive mourning. Interesting here to be brought up again in another context of death and mourning. This precious ornament discarded in the moss. There lay a section of a bow with a good spring still retained in its ancient fibers. Nearby was a stone meat cache filled with the bones and hair of many deer which had been left to rot away unused. Down by the sandy shore, immense square blocks of stone had been upended to form winter resting places for kayaks where they would be secure from the ever-hungry dogs. No dogs had found them, but time had taken them instead. The fragile bones of the little vessels were complete, and only the skin coverings had vanished, leaving the naked frames to look like skeletons of slim and graceful beasts, denuded of all flesh. The sunlit meadow seemed to darken as I walked among these somber relics of an unknown tragedy. I seemed to hear the echoes of that fatal tale, and a confused babble of soundless voices filled my ears, trying desperately to tell me of what had come to pass in this lovely and hidden place. They spoke of the nemesis which had fallen upon this camp, with such savagery that men gave no heed to their most precious possessions as they fled. But had they fled? What terror could have made a woman abandon this elaborately carved meat tray, a thing of enduring value, to split and whiten under the long summer suns? And how could men flee when their kayaks and winter sleds remained in the deserted camp? Yeah, I remember in an earlier chapter, Mowat talking about what incredible love and hard work men put into the making of their kayaks, like it was an extension of themselves. At its last life, the camp must have held many people, for the tents had been immense, many of them 20 feet across the base. Most of the present tents of the hamlet are dwarfed little cones, half that size, and yet they shelter families of 7 or 8, and sometimes more. The great tents by Ankuni could each have held a dozen people comfortably, and this one camp may have contained 100 souls who appeared to have mysteriously vanished out of time. Vanished, yes, but where? The question was soon answered. A few 100 feet behind the camp there was a broken outcropping of black rock, and here I found the people whom I sought. Each lay in an igloo-shaped stone crypt, each in his ageless home, surrounded by some few tools which he had used in life. The graves were so closely crowded in the limited space suitable for making tombs that many overlapped, and some had been forced to house more than one occupant. I counted 37 in one place that had all been built hurriedly and at the same time, or at least within a few weeks of each other. The scanty nature of those structures and the paucity of tools within them proclaimed that death had allowed no time for careful ceremony. Evidently, whole families had perished at one time, and the few tools and weapons belonging to the family had been thinly divided amongst many souls who would have need of them in the world of Kaila, god of the skies. Not yet surfeited with horror, I searched farther afield, and beyond the main graveyard I found where the dwelling survivors of the terror had abandoned all efforts to give the dead their due. Here the bones lay in shallow hollows, scraped in the moss, and no one had bothered to provide these ghosts with the tools they would need on their eternal journey. The terror must have been nearing its peak when these naked ones were buried, and the camp must have been all but deserted then. Certainly, if any had still lived on, they would have been quick to move away as the graves multiplied, for it is an inflexible rule amongst the people that tents must not be pitched near where the dead lie at rest. The dead had come to occupy the place, and the camp was given over to them, while the few surviving Kinetuamuit had attempted their escape. Right now I'm thinking about COVID and what we consider an epidemic, and 1% or so of the people who get it die from it, and some people get hospitalized, and just thinking how exponentially and orders of magnitude worse, culture destroying, community destroying this was. Once again, a sense of perspective and gratitude. Before I left that camp, the dead spoke to me and told me of their terror. Though there was no other sound than the harsh piping of the wind, The voices spoke in such a way that I could not misunderstand. I knew how the Kinetuamuit had died. It was not from starvation, for there had been funeral presents of deer quarters on many of the graves. It was not from violence, for the bones of the dead were unscarred and whole. Kinetuamuit died because they had received our gift. It was the great pain of Kakumi's tale. Once again, I think he said it was likely tuberculosis. Perhaps, I thought, a few had escaped, but where had they gone and what was their ultimate fate? I found the answer to those questions, too, as I walked away from the sunlit meadows out into the surrounding plains, which stretched away inland. A few miles from the shore, I stumbled on a tiny tent of ring consisting of half a dozen stones, barely sufficient to anchor the flimsiest shelter, and in this circle lay one who had fled the terror. The wolverines had given him what burial he needed. Twice in the next mile, I found rock crevices into which men's bodies had been roughly stuffed to find what protection there might be from the weather and the beasts. These were the men who had fled the camps beside Kinatua Bay, and they had not escaped. I walked back to the shore and followed it to the mouth of the river, a distance of 10 miles, and I found 3 other great camps that had died under the plague. Beyond the last of these was an ancient burial ground which had existed long before the great pain came, and in it I saw the manner in which the Kinetuamuit cared for their dead when gave them the time. Thinking on a much larger scale, like I said earlier, the how North America, between attempts to colonize the eastern shores by Europeans, how it seemed magically cleared as if by the Christian gods' hands, largely by disease, and how these kinds of stories like this must have gone on in mass scale across all of North America during that intervening period. This disease raged across the continent, particularly up and down the, the heart vein of the country, the Mississippi River and all its branches. What terrible sadness and horror. A tall gray pole marked one burial mound whose roof had been constructed of the owner's long winter sled. The openings had been neatly filled with rocks and thatched with willow, and the whole, WHOLE, was so well made that the crypt had remained almost intact. Beside the grave were deer spears, a snow knife, bow drills, arrows, and a stone lamp containing 5 wonderfully made stone pipes, and many other needful things to show that this man had left the world well prepared to face the next. This was a peaceful grave, and it was in startling contrast to the ones near the plague camps. When I turned back, I found myself hurrying, and I felt an almost hysterical desire to see living men again. I almost ran the last few yards to camp, where I was greeted by Ohoto, and in turn greeted the Eskimo with an effusiveness which startled him. Ohoto told me he had found no deer, but he said the land to the north appeared to have been one of the greatest highways the deer had ever used. This was small comfort, for we had expected to find the deer themselves at Ankuni, and we had counted on stocking up with meat so we could continue our explorations into the unknown lands to the northwest. Our food supplies, brought from Windy Camp, were almost exhausted, and we did not care to risk missing the deer by starting off to a distant part of the barrens, which the deer might never visit. Sometimes I think it's interesting when I misspeak and use the wrong word. It's almost like on the fly, my subconscious is intentionally picking a certain word to say, trying to guess in advance, and how often the misspoken word seems oddly applicable to a different subtle interpretation of what the reading is and what it might be. I've noticed I'm not breaking either at the 15-minute marks or before the 15-minute marks. I'll have to fix it in post, as they say in the filmmaking world. I guess what I'm doing here is kind of like was something I was hearing in the last day or so. Somebody who was making film, who learned the filmmaking trade back in the early 80s on home VHS video equipment, where you literally couldn't edit anything and you had to meticulously plan everything in advance so that it was perfect. And it reminds me of one time in the 90s making home videos, a movie with friends, and everything had to be done right the first time, and you had to have an advanced knowledge of exactly how long it took the video to pause when it was recording, and you press the pause button, because the cut wouldn't happen exactly when you press the pause button, and the recording wouldn't start exactly when you unpaused it. And I was the camera person, and the people who were doing the acting didn't really seem to appreciate the advanced planning that I was doing as the camera person. There's a little bit of it here in this kind of performance, solo audio performance, when it all is done right. When I know after a paragraph or so, I'm not going to just smoothly paste in the next paragraph if I misstep. I'm just reading things unbroken in 50-minute blocks. Not even doing 5-minute blocks like I was doing when I quit on Photo Booth. And to be honest, I still haven't tried to process any of these full chapter readings that I've been doing on live stream. Using iMovie, I've just been recording them and downloading them already and letting them backlog. That was a long tangent. Maybe I'm trying to escape from the sadness of what I'm reading. Where did I leave off? Our food supplies brought from Windy Camp were almost exhausted, and we did not care to risk missing the deer by starting off to a distant part of the barrens which the deer might never visit. So we began a period of waiting that stretched into days, then into weeks. As patiently as possible, we waited for the deer. But patience was soon exhausted by the hordes of flies which also waited hungrily, but that were willing to accept us as substitutes until the deer did come. For days on end, we three were forced to stay in our tents while viscous masses of mosquitoes and black flies hung like living tapestries on the outside of our mosquito nets. We partially escaped the blood-hungry throngs by keeping inside, but we had other tortures to contend with, for the sun was without pity, and the tiny cubes of motionless air enclosed by our tent was often heated to the point where our water bucket grew surprisingly hot. Those were not pleasant days, but perhaps one day in 3 would bring a wind, and then, as if by some benevolent sorcery, the flies would vanish and our imprisonment would be briefly broken. On one of these days, I wandered for almost 20 miles along the shores of Ankuni, looking for signs of living things, and I saw not a bird nor an animal. On another day, I did manage to surprise a covey of half-grown ptarmigan in a swale, and once I saw a single gyrfalcon, a great gray-winged shadow that swept low over the crest of a hill, cried piercingly, and vanished swiftly. But there were no deer, no Arctic hares, no ground squirrels, no foxes, and almost no other birds. Deserted and as empty as they were, the Ankuni Plains did give me one rare gift, and that lay in the opportunities I found for long talks with Ohoto. As our enforced idleness dragged on, Ohoto became almost garrulous, and I had the unusual good sense to take advantage of it. Just before dusk one day, a strong south wind sprang up. Ohoto and I sallied gratefully out from our prison and climbed the crest of a high hill to scan the distant plains for deer. As usual, we saw no sign of Tuktu, but it was a pleasant evening, so we sat amongst the broken rocks of the hilltop, smoked our pipes, and waited for the low sun to pass from sight. It was then Ohoto told me the helmet story of Genesis and something about the early days of man. Things were not always as you see them now, Ohoto began, then paused to drag furiously at his pipe. In the beginning there was no sun in the sky, and the land of those far times was warm and dry. No snow lay on it, and no rain fell. And it was so when Kyla, he who is thunder in the gray skies, knew it was time to bring life into the land. First, Kyla made the hare and the ptarmigan and sent them down through darkness and bade them multiply until their tracks covered all hills and valleys of the dark and hidden world. So the ptarmigan and the hare went into darkness and did as they were told. There came the time when they were many, and Kyla saw that they were many, and he knew the land was ready. And Kyla took the first woman and the first man, and these two he sent into the world which lay ready to receive them. Yet Kyla, who sees without eyes, in darkness as in light, forgot that men see nothing in the dark. But it was so, and the man could not see, and hunger came upon the first man and woman, for though the hares and ptarmigan were many, the first hunter could not see to make his kill. Then the woman stood on a high place and cried out to Kyla, begging for his aid. And Kyla heard, and he sent fire into the darkness, and then there was both light to see by and heat to cook upon. It became the woman's task to keep the fires alive, for it had been her gift from Kyla. But the man thrust his forefinger deep into the coal so that it caught fire and became a flaming torch. Then, with this torch to light the way, the first man roamed the hills, and many were the hares and ptarmigan that fell beneath his hand. So, for a long time, the man and woman lived in peace and with full bellies. But at length, hares and ptarmigan grew weary of the hunter's torch, and they fled into ground and into air. Hunger came again to the first man and woman. Once again, the woman stood on a high hill and cried her sorrows. And once more Kyla heard and answered her. He heard and spoke, telling her to dig a great hole in the ground, so deep that none might see its bottom. When the hole was dug, Kyla bade the woman make a strong line from the plaited sinews of many hares, and a sharp hook from the wing bones of the ptarmigan. And this too was done as Kyla said that it must be. When Kyla bade the woman try her skill with the hook and line in the deep hole that had been dug, the woman sat beside the hole, holding her line, while the man stood beside her, letting the flame of his great torch send shadows dancing into the hole. Then came a sudden tug on the line. Quickly the woman hauled it up and dragged the first wolf from the bowels of the earth. But the wolf was an eater of meat and no giver of meat, and so the woman cast him loose, bidding him multiply and to become many over the land. The wolf heard the woman and obeyed her words. Again and yet again the woman flung her hook into the hole, and always when a weight came up on it, she drew it up. In this way she caught all the beasts of the land: Amau the white wolf, Kakwick the gray wolverine, Akla the great brown bear, Hikik the red-haired squirrel, Omingmuk the shaggy muskox, and all other beasts which walk the world. And yet it happened that none of these was what the woman desired, and after speaking to each as she had spoken to the wolf, she freed them all and cast her line again. After the land beasts came the beasts of air: Tingmea the white goose, Uulnik the long-tailed duck, and all the lesser beasts of air. But none of these was what the woman sought until she freed them into the darkness, speaking to them as she had spoken to the wolf. After the beasts of the air came the beasts of the water, Ichloa, the red trout, Attenju, the soft sucker, and all the lesser beasts of water. But still, not one of these was what the woman sought. And so she freed them into the lakes and rivers, speaking always as she had first spoken to the wolf. Now came a time when no new weight fell upon the line, and the man grew weary of his vigil by the hole. He would have slept, for the world was filled with many kinds of game, and he was satisfied. But the woman rebuked him, for she was stubborn, and all her daughters have been ever since. And she had still not caught the one thing which she sought. We did not know how long the woman lingered by the hole, for then there was no winter and no summer, no day and no night. But in the end, there came a great jerk on the line, so that it was almost torn from the woman's hands. The man sprang to help her, and together they pulled the sinew rope out of the pit. It was a mighty struggle, and yet man and his woman triumphed, and so they at last beheld the antlered crown of Tuktu, first of all the deer. The woman cried out with joy and flung her hook away, and the deep hole closed up and vanished. Then the woman spoke to the first deer, saying, "Go out over the land and become as many as all other things which live in the water, land, or air. For it is you and your kind who will feed me and my children, and my children's children, for all time there is yet to come." The first deer heard and heeded what the woman said, and so it came about that there were many deer. That paragraph ends with an ellipsis, and it's a change of voice back to Mowat. Ohoto ceased his tale, and together we looked out over the broad isthmus where the gravels and lichens bore the trails of many deer. Those trails were so many they were like a close-knit web covering all the land. We looked in silence until at last I asked, "What of the first woman and her man?" "For longer than I know," Ohoto continued. That was in hard brackets. The first man and woman lived in the dark world. Yet though Tuktu was there and hunger had been banished, still the man's loins stayed dry and the woman's womb was empty as an ancient skull. So might it always have remained had not it been for Hekenjuk, the sun, the giver of new life. Hekenjuk came to us because of a great battle fought between the wolf and the wolverine in times long past. Of all the beasts in the land, Kakwik the wolverine is strongest and most cunning. Because of his great cunning, Kakwik learned to hunt in darkness. But Amau the wolf, who could never learn, and often enough he blundered into rocks while the deer he chased so blindly laughed at him and fled away. In those times, Kakwik and Amau lived together in a cave sunken deep into the rocks, and once they were digging at the back of the cave, they chanced to uncover the bright face of Hekenjuk, who had been buried by Kyla at the first of things. Amau was happy then, and cried, "Let us free the sun, for then there will be light in darkness, and I shall see to make a mighty hunt." But Kakwik had no desire to see the wolf become a hunter of great skill, and he would not agree with the white wolf, but kicked the dirt back over the gleaming sun. This was the beginning of the battle. But in those days, all animals spoke in the same tongue with man, and when they fought with words alone. Kakwik fought with the first wolf, and the sound of battle echoed over all the hills and was as the sound as loud as thunder. Amau was clever, yet Kakwik was more clever, and so at length the wolf was beaten and fled back into the cave, while Kakwik went out to hunt. But when Kakwik was gone, Amau quickly uncovered Hekenjuk and freed him from the grip of the rocks. Flaming, the sun rose to the peak of the black sky, and all darkness vanished. Kakwik was filled with rage, a rage so great that even high Heckenjuk trembled, and so to placate the wolverine, the sun agreed to go back into hiding for part of the day. And thus it is we have the change from night to day. Just love the different stories. Not something to be dismissed as mere fanciful mythology. The ways people, prior to quote unquote science, explain the nature of the world. Makes me think of the great passage in Ishmael, where Ishmael tries to explore the way so much of civilization story about its origin is mythology, and the narrator, who at that time is in that book is not named, he's uncomprehending. He doesn't think that anything about civilization story about itself is mythology. It's all true. It's all science. So Ishmael tells a story of a time traveler, a human who goes back into the very early days of human life, where the most advanced form of life is jellyfish and the planet. And the jellyfish can talk, and the human being is asking about its fanciful tales to explain the nature of the world, and the jellyfish is uncomprehending. He doesn't know any fanciful tales about the nature of the world. He just knows what's true and scientific. And so the jellyfish tells this tale of life and the growth of the earth and evolution, and though at the end of it he puffs himself off and said, "At last, jellyfish appeared." The message very clearly being that what's mythological about human beings thinking is that human beings, and particularly civilization, is the culmination of evolution, what everything has been leading towards, instead of just one aspect of the whole great story, which is ongoing if human beings don't succeed in putting an end to evolution out of ego and saying this is where it stops. Now it is all about us. Earth is nothing but a staging ground for this particular stage of evolution for this particular species. And I also like the way human beings are seen as a part, intelligent and in some ways special among the other creatures of nature, but not the only thing that matters. It's clear that other forms of life are not just tools and resources in the great storage shed of humanity. With the coming of the sun, the seasons came, and now in the summer, when the hunting is not hard, the wolf grows strong, and so the days are longer. But in winter, when the hunting of the deer is hard, Cackwick is stronger, and the sun must hide, so the days then are short. Now, when Kyla saw that Heckenjuk the sun had been freed without his knowledge, he was mightily enraged. His lightning shattered the sky, and his storms blew over the breadth of the land. The skies grew as angry as foam at the foot of the rapids, and Nipelo the rain first fell over the world. So also came Aput and Hiko, the snow and ice, and also the blizzards which live in the long winter nights. And because of these things, Kyla is known to this day as the god of all weather. Even today, his anger lives, and our world is only a toy for his anger to crush. You know, I myself thinking now about human beings and civilization, particularly those aspects and cultures, subcultures of the one culture of civilization that grow up in temperate and tropical zones where weather is mild, and combine that with our technology, and we imagine ourselves to have mastered the elements. There are sometimes occasional terrible weather events where we get a hint that we're lying to ourselves, and global climate change, of course, is the great sledgehammer slowly coming down to break our deadly, tumorescent, cancerous ego. Ohoto paused again. In the evening sky, the dark rage of Kyla was massing, and the sun was shrinking before it. Flames roared down from the zenith to lose themselves in the angry black clouds which poured up from the horizon like coils of thick smoke, and spread out over the pallid face of the sky. Then somewhere in the storm-darkened hills, a white wolf howled sadly, and the echoing cry wavered over the lake like the voice of the first of all wolves bewailing the loss of the sun. The long echoes shattered and died as Ohoto once again took up his tale. It's going to be a long chapter here. It's almost been an hour. I think the longest one I've done is an hour and 5 minutes. After a time, the woman grew big in the belly, for with the coming of Hekenjuk, the giver of life, the loins of the man had grown heavy with seed. Seed. The image. The woman gave birth to her child, and these were not men as we know them, but dogs. From her womb came forth litters of dogs, yet in those times all things spoke the same tongue with man, and so all things were brothers, even with the man, and the dogs were man's brothers too. Now in those days the man and woman lived in a camp by a vast inland sea which lies far off to the west. But soon that camp by the Sweetwater Sea was filled with the children the woman endlessly bore. At last there were so many the man could not hunt for them all. He grew weary, and even the woman, their mother, grew weary. So on a day she took off her deerskin boot and blew into it, and by her magic it became a great boat. Then she launched the boat on the waters of the Sweetwater Sea, and in it she placed most of the children she had borne. When the wind came out of the north, the woman pushed the boat free, and the wind took it southward until it was gone from her sight. The boat sailed on into the south until it passed from the lands of our people into the deep, hidden lands where the forests cover the world. Here the boat entered the mouth of a river that ran aground on a shoal. Many of the dogs in the boat were hungry and were sick of the water, so some of them swam to shore and entered the forests where they have lived ever since, for they have become Yitkilit, the Indian peoples. But still the wind blew from the north, and at last the boat slipped free of the shoal and drifted on to the south. How far? No one knows. When it at length came to rest, the remainder of the dogs entered into an unknown land, and here they became Kablunai, the fathers and grandfathers of you and your kind. Not all the dogs were sent away, and I got to stop for a second because at first it was like Mowat talking to the readers of the book, and almost like I felt this presumption of racism that all people reading this book are white people from civilization. And I remembered that it was Ohoto talking and talking to Mowat. Subconscious acting on me again. Not all the dogs were sent away in that boat, for some remained in the camp by the inland sea, and these were the ones the woman favored over all of the others. After a time, these became the fathers and grandfathers of me and my kind, for they were the first Inuit, the first men. So all non-Inuit aren't fully men, they're more descendant of dogs. Every culture can see itself as egocentric, but that's where the difference comes, is the live and let live attitude that more or less allowed native cultures to coexist, whereas civilization grows endlessly and devours all other cultures, trying to turn them into related images of itself, like cancer, of course. As Ohoto finished speaking, The sullen darkness of the storm swept over the great lake, and the long moan of the coming wind rose above the cry of the distant wolf. All along the stark and rocky shores which lay beneath us were the old camps of the Inuit, and they were as silent as the dead soul of the land. Dimly I saw the stone circles which marked the place of tents, with the lichens growing high amongst them. Beyond the stone rings, up on the ridges, where the frost-shattered rocks of the slope stood upended like tombstones disordered by earthquakes, there were people. There were the people. Little mounds, little rock mounds, rose above the stone surface like gray boils on the bones of the land. All along the darkening shores the little mounds rose, and under each of them slept a son of the woman, with the tools he had used in his life by his side. End of the chapter all of a sudden. There was no gap at the end of my Kindle page to give me any warning. But when next I'm up, chapter 16, From the Inland Sea. Yeah. Fond memories of this chapter, but I'll get to it later. Thanks for listening.